Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today I am on the road. So I don't have my normal gun background behind me because I'm in a hotel room tonight recording this month's Q&A. So I figured we'd do this with the help of a nice glass of wine, or a plastic cup of decent wine. And I have a whole bunch of questions from you guys, my fantastic Patreon supporters. If you would like to get one of your questions in on these videos, well, sign up to support on patreon.com. There's a link in the description text below. And every month when I'm setting up to do one of these Q&As, I will post a request there for questions. So I'm going to pour myself some of this, and we will start with a question from Eric, who says, in a number of your videos shooting full auto firearms, you reference the effect of, quote, the world going gray and fuzzy. Can you identify some of the factors that might cause this effect to be more pronounced in some guns more than others, i.e. the G3 and the FAL, and some steps gun designers may have taken to mitigate it? Yes, actually, I think I can describe some of those. So I think the two major issues that contribute to a firearm really being quite difficult to fire in full auto are going to be the physical recoil impulse that actually hits the shooter, which is not the same as the recoil impulse that's generated by the gun, and the concussion. So guns that have shorter barrels, especially short barrels with muzzle brakes, the G3 is a good example, generate quite a lot of concussion when they fire, more so than a longer barrel. And that definitely contributes to some disorientation for the shooter. The other major effect is recoil hitting the shooter's body. Let me get distracted here. And if you watch firearms, especially machine guns in slow motion, and I have a bunch of slow motion video where you can see this, what you'll see is when the gun fires, when the cartridge fires, the gun doesn't actually move. You'll see flash and smoke at the muzzle, and the action starts to cycle. And the gun doesn't actually move relative to the shooter until the action has cycled all the way. And typically what will happen is the bolt will get to the rear of the receiver and it'll still have energy. It'll still be moving, and it will come to a dead stop against the back end of the receiver. When that happens, the energy that was still in the bolt is transferred to the shooter's shoulder. And at that point, you'll see the gun kick back and the shooter kick back with it. The best thing, I think, that you can do with a machine gun to make it more controllable and pleasant, inoffensive in full auto fire, is to design the recoil such that the bolt fully decelerates to a stop without actually physically contacting the back end of the receiver. One of the most famous guns to do this was the Ultimax light machine gun, designed by Jim Sullivan, and he specifically incorporated what he called a constant recoil system, a large part of which was the bolt having enough space and the right spring balance behind it so that it never actually hit the back of the receiver. As such, it never transfers a jolt for each shot to the shooter. You get just the much more pleasant and unobtrusive recoil that is the little bit that is put into the shooter's body while the bolt is actually moving. So if you combine that, something like not necessarily a constant recoil system, but a fully decelerated bolt, along with typically a barrel that is long enough to pretty much fully burn the powder in the cartridge before the bullet exits the barrel, something that reduces as much as possible the concussion and the blast from firing. Those two things together, I think, will give you the most pleasant firing machine guns. That is why, in many ways, well, I'm just trying to think of some of the guns that are more pleasant to shoot. The PKM is one, which I think does both of those things. The G3 is a kind of a harsh gun to fire, and I think that's actually both factors again. I think it's the bolt impacting on the back of the receiver, or at least in that one, the spring fully compressing, and so the bolt kind of impacts on the fully compressed spring, which is going to transfer momentum, transfer energy the same way that hitting the back of the receiver would, as well as the G3 having a relatively short barrel, especially compared to something like the FAL. So I think that pretty well covers that. Let's move on to Kyle's question. Do you ever plan to revisit firearms already looked at in your very old videos? Yes, definitely. There are a couple, the Bren gun and the Lewis gun in particular, I would like to revisit. I have a much better camera now. I think I could do a much better video on them. It's just a matter of having access to those guns and a good opportunity to redo the videos. I will point out there have been a number of my very, very early videos that I have had a chance to redo. The ZH-29 shooting for one, and what was it? The ZK-420S I had an opportunity to redo, and in both of those cases I think I did a much better video the second time than I did the first. So yeah, some of the old ones definitely plan to redo. Now, I keep getting distracted here. I am actually going to have a nice glass of wine while I'm doing this. All right. Yeah, it's not bad. All right, moving on. Andrew asks, is the MP5 still relevant as a platform? Yes, which I'm not sure why it wouldn't be. The MP5 is still a quite capable submachine gun. I think if there's anything that is approaching irrelevancy in the MP5, it would be the very concept of a submachine gun. In many circles, the light caliber carbine, basically the short-barreled M16 or AK, has kind of does everything that a submachine gun does and a little bit more. There are some very specialized roles for a submachine gun, but I think it's not so much the MP5 becoming obsolete as the submachine gun as a whole concept becoming obsolete. Not that it is, but some people would consider it to be. Next up, Luke says, are you just as excited to learn about different firearms as we, the viewers? Often, yes. In fact, I occasionally find this happening to me at auction houses where I'll be looking through and I need to find a whole bunch of different guns I'm going to do video on, and there are some guns that I do video on that I would be interested in owning, and some that I don't, just because they're not in my particular, not in the area that I would really like to collect myself. Sometimes the ones I really want to buy, I don't do video on, so that I don't publicize them a bit more. At any rate, I know I've done a particularly good video when I start with a gun where my attitude is, oh yeah, that's a cool gun, I'd like to cover that one on the channel, but it's not something I need to buy. So perfect one for a video. And I get the gun in and I take it apart and I handle it and I figure out what's going on and what's the good story to tell about this gun. And by the time I'm done filming, I'm really, kicking myself for doing a video because now, wow, I kind of really want to own this one. Maybe I shouldn't have done the video and maybe I should try and bid on it myself. When that happens, and that happens a fair amount actually, then yeah, I definitely know I've done well on the video. So yes, I wouldn't be doing this if I wasn't genuinely excited about the various new and different things that I get to take a look at. Paul says, is there a significant difference in the machining and production methods of firearms versus other high-performance metal tools? Or is just the applied knowledge of what's a bad idea in a firearm, that goes into manufacturing? How much has tooling changed over the years? Naturally, there was a big introduction of stampings and pressings in World War II and after, and the metallurgy involved. How would you machine a firearm on circa 1900 tooling to modern standards? Well, so two questions. First off, is there a substantial difference between making firearms and making other precision metal stuff? And the answer is no, not really. In fact, a lot of the manufacturers that started making guns in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years were predominantly aerospace manufacturing firms. They'd been making all manner of small parts on contract for aerospace companies, and when they saw the gun market really taking off, that looked like a great place to invest some of their extra open machine time. And so it is in fact substantially more difficult to be an aerospace manufacturing firm than a firearms parts manufacturing firm. In general, I would say from the perspective of someone looking to get into the industry, if you have a general machining background as as a mechanical engineer on the design end or as just a standard machine parts operator, I think you'll find the skills very interchangeable between firearm parts and aircraft parts or automotive parts or pretty much anything. Firearms parts require a pretty good degree of precision, but not as much as some other industries. And certainly firearms parts are not substantially more difficult than really any other real machining area of expertise. Now, as for machining firearms on early production tooling, I would say the big difference has been obviously the introduction of CNC machining. But what CNC has allowed is, on the one hand, it's easier to make high precision parts, but it's not trivial. You still have to put a lot of work into it. You have to understand how you're fixturing parts so that they don't move or vibrate. You have to understand what's involved in your tool lifespan. You can take a super accurate, precise machine, and if you run cutting tools in it too long, they will become dull, and you will not be able to cut very precise parts anymore, no matter how good the machine is, if the tooling is not, is worn out or is not adequately precise itself to begin with. But then the other thing that CNC really allows is multiple operations in one, multiple cuts in one operation, let's put it that way, where you can clamp a part in a CNC and do a bunch of different things to it simultaneously. Not everything. I think a lot of people thinking about CNC machining who don't have any actual experience in it, think about it as this kind of magic do-everything machine. And you put a part in the machine and then it can do all of the cuts on that part. In reality, you have to firmly and accurately hold that component in the machine. And so often you'll hold it in one position and you can do cuts on like this side of the part. And then you have to come up with a new fixture to hold the part in another orientation so that other sides of the part are exposed and able to be worked on. So you can't just like drop a piece of metal in a CNC machine and push a button and have it spit a finished component out. You do have to usually have multiple operations, multiple setups in that machine. And the way this used to work was every individual cut basically had its own machine. So a number of years ago, I had an opportunity to visit FN in Belgium. And one of the cool things that they had in their production area was they still had the original tooling for making Browning high-powered barrels. And this was like, it's gotten a little fuzzy in the years since I was there, but it seemed to me like it was 50 solid yards, lines of shapers, basically a machine tool with a horizontal cutting wheel, and there were literally a couple dozen of these machines in a row, and you'd start with this blank part, and you put it in the first machine, and the first machine would do one contour cut of something, and then you'd put that into the second machine, and the second machine had this very specific fixture and a very specifically ground cutting tool on it, and you'd run the part through that machine and it would make a second cut. We have one curve here and we have the second half of a curve in the next machine, and this would just continue. And some of these would drill holes, some of them would cut flat surfaces, some of them would run angled cuts or curved cuts, but basically one operation on every single machine, and by the time you got to the end, out comes a finished part. Now, this was a very labor-intensive thing. You had an operator on every single machine. But that's kind of how fabrication went before some of the automation that we have today. And this is why you'll hear about a firearm taking a year or 18 months or long periods of time between when the design is finished, and there's this set of blueprints in hand, and when they can actually start mass-producing guns. And the reason for that is they have to build all of this tooling so that every one of those operations is correct and in the proper sequence, and make sure that all the tolerances stack correctly. There's an immense amount of work. You could almost say it's as much work to design the gun in the first place as it is to take a set of raw blueprints and then actually convert that into machine tooling to produce guns. One of the interesting things about the M1 Garand in U.S. service is that John Garand was almost equally involved in designing the gun in the first place and then also designing the machinery and the tooling to produce it, which are two really equally important issues. There are some guns, the Colt All-American 2000, for example, that as a prototype, as a hand-built sample gun, was really quite good. And by the time it came out of this development, the process of changing it or adapting it for mass production destroyed it. The guns that came out the end of the production line were not really very good. They had lots of problems, despite the fact that they started off as a pretty good prototype design. And it was a failure in that case of Colt to properly design the production process to spit out usable guns at the end of the line. All right, next up from Rowan. Okay, Rowan says, are you aware a lot of Nerf gun enthusiasts watch this channel and actually incorporate concepts from real firearms into our Nerf projects? Do you have much experience with Nerf guns? I don't think I have any experience with Nerf guns in at least 15 years. Kind of cool that people are taking unusual firearms concepts and working them into Nerf guns, though. That's neat. I would not have expected that. Interesting. Next off, Jonathan says, any chance we might see some videos on Korobov prototype guns in the future? That's this Bakelite, it's the one I'm thinking of. It's this Bakelite stocked bullpup 8K magazine using Russian thing. Says, I know there are a lot of folks who would like to see the insides of those crazy Bakelite creations. I would too. I would love to take one of those apart. As far as I know, the only ones in existence are in Russia. I would very much like to get to Russia someday, but at this point, I don't really have any connections in Russia. It will be a process for me to develop the right connections in the right museums and get permission and access, and hopefully someday I will be able to take a look at not just the Kobarovs, but all sorts of other crazy, weird AK Russian prototypes that they have over there. Andrew says, I always see you and Carl in various military surplus items, either while shooting or just in your other videos. Any particular military surplus piece or pieces of kit you would consider your favorite? Anything I should be looking for? What country's gear is the coolest in your opinion? Well, that's an elaborate question. I would say most of the military surplus that I deal with is not particularly conducive to ease of use and ease of shooting with. Most of the mag pouches are really designed primarily to protect the stuff in them, which makes sense. They are carried a lot more than they are actually used. However, when I'm doing something like shooting a match, it's really kind of obnoxious to use most of this correct military web gear, because compared to anything else that we're used to seeing in competition, it is glacially slow. The one exception, though, or the one exception that comes to mind, and this isn't at all an uncommon or forgotten thing, is the M1 Garand cartridge belt, also used for the Springfield and 1917 Enfield rifles. That 10-pocket cartridge belt that the U.S. issued is an excellent piece of kit. I don't know that there are many people who are using M1 Garands in competition, but if you are, get one of those belts. Those things are awesome. They are remarkably quick to use. I'm really happy whenever I'm able to actually use one of those belts. They're great. Most of the rest of the stuff, it's interesting to use to see just how difficult it made life for the average soldier who had to use it. To throw out one other example, I guess, one of the particularly bad designs was the U.S. World War I haversack. I believe it was pattern of 1910, if I remember correctly, kind of updated in 1928 and used substantially in World War II, and the updates really didn't help it very much. It's literally not a pack at all. It is a flat, kind of cross-shaped piece of cloth with a bunch of straps, and you kind of lay it out and you put your stuff on it, and then you fold all the bits over and strap it down, and there's basically no way to get easy access. There's basically no way to access anything in it without completely taking the thing off, laying it down on the ground, and opening it all up. It's a really terrible piece of gear. It's amazing that the U.S. was issuing that horrible pack and the same awesome cartridge belt at exactly the same time. Moving on, James says, worst officially adopted U.S. service rifle and pistol, and why? Well, that's a loaded question that's going to get me some hate no matter what I say. There aren't that many U.S. adopted service pistols, and none of them were really particularly bad. So I'm going to bypass that, and we will look at just the service rifle. And I will say probably, well, how about Yeah. How about this? Probably the worst adopted U.S. service rifle would be the Rod Bayonet Trapdoor Springfield. The Trapdoor Springfield wasn't a bad rifle. It maybe wasn't the best rifle that could have been adopted at the time. It probably would have been better to adopt the Remington rolling block, but the government thought they could save some money and get a better deal by adapting muzzleloaders to the Trapdoor Springfield pattern. It didn't really work out that way, but that's part of why they adopted it. The Rod Bayonet, however, in particular, was a really bad idea. Theodore Roosevelt saw that thing, and his immediate reaction was, "That's a horrible piece of junk." And when you get that kind of reaction from a guy like Theodore Roosevelt, that should be a hint. And as such, it really wasn't in service very long. The other gun that, honestly, and this will definitely get me some hate, the other gun that would be on that list would be the M14. Largely because of the production issues involved. The government had a terrible time getting the M14 into production with adequate quality control. It was actually a rifle that spent more time in development than it did in actual field service. It was just about the shortest service life of any U.S. military formal rifle before being replaced by the M16. The Italians put the BM-59 together in something like 2 years, and the Americans took 12 years to figure out how to do the same thing. Basically, all they had to do was put a box magazine on the M1 Garand. That rifle already existed in 1945, and yet they went back and ended up taking 12 years to figure out the design, and then never did really manage to put it into effective production. Next up, Daniel says, "What was the most uncomfortable firearm you have ever shot?" Well, there are a couple contenders. The worst recoiling one I've ever shot was definitely the 4-bore single rifle. That thing is a behemoth. I believe that rifle weighed 23 pounds, but it was firing a literal quarter-pound bullet, and that recoil was really intense. Even with a 23-pound rifle, leaning way into it and pulling it tight into the shoulder, that thing was definitely an experience to shoot. Now, there have been a couple others. I recently shot a Dreyse .32 caliber carbine, which had no recoil at all to speak of, except that I kept putting my thumb over the back of the wrist of the stock and managed to smash my thumb twice with the bolt of that gun. That was rather unpleasant. Beyond that, you know what? The pistol grip only Mossberg pump shotgun. Carl and I did a video on the Mossberg Shockwave and the idea of pistol grip only pump shotguns as home defense guns or any sort of practical gun. And through the course of that video, we did a bunch of shooting with a stock shotgun and also a pistol grip only shotgun. And that PGO shotgun was one of the very few guns that has actually physically hurt me to shoot. That thing left the web of my hand sore for almost a week. I should have been wearing a shooting glove the whole time, and I didn't think I needed to. And by the end of that video, I was really, really happy to be done shooting that stupid thing. Next up, from Christopher, says, "I have collected most of the cheap surplus that has come out in the past 10 years. Mosin Nagants, Steyr Mannlichers, Russian captured K98s, Yugo Mausers, SKSs, Lee Enfields, Spanish Mausers, many Comblock pistols, among other common stuff. What, in your opinion, would be a good gun to add that would bring a lot of gravitas to a collection? I was thinking semi-autos like FN49s, Hakims, or SVTs. Would I consider those respectable?" Well, respectable is kind of an interesting term. Definitely they are. They're cool guns. They're interesting to have in a collection. I would not advise someone to try and make a collection based on what they think like common perception of a collection ought to be. If you're collecting guns, you ought to be collecting them because they're of interest to you. They're guns that make you happy, that you're interested in. And there's no need for them to be super expensive guns if super expensive guns don't happen to be what makes you happy. If you want to collect Chinese mystery pistols, those things are not expensive. But There's a huge variety of them. I find them very interesting myself. A lot of other people do as well. And they're definitely not what a lot of snooty collectors would consider respectable guns. None of them are in great shape. They're all terribly they're mostly terribly poorly made, but that doesn't mean they're not suitable for collecting. They're pretty cool. There are, for example, a gazillion different varieties of those Steyr Mannlicher M95s. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having a cool, interesting, and complete, or very complete collection of those carbines. So there are a couple things you can do. If you want to have a wide-ranging collection, then sure, a wide variety of the more accessible semi-auto rifles is a fine way to go. The other thing you could do is take a look at what you have currently and consider which of them you're actually most interested in, and then start looking at getting some of the more specialized, rarer, more exclusive guns in that niche. So if it's the Lee Enfields that you really find that you're really interested in, well, okay, so the Ishapore Enfields are pretty easy and accessible to get. SMLEs are pretty easy. A number 4 Enfield's pretty easy. But then you can start looking at some of the more rare ones, like a number 1 Mark V with its transitional rear-mounted sights. I think those are really cool. They're harder to find. They're more expensive than some of the more common guns, but that would be, I think, equally appropriate to get as adding different available semi-autos. So in general, figure out what it is that really interests you and use that as the focus of your collection. Daniel says, what firearm was the most frustrating to disassemble and reassemble? In general, the guns that are actually stressful or frustrating are the ones where I'm worried about damaging something. So usually this comes down to 2 different types of guns. It could be guns that are not in perfect mechanical shape. If the gun's really worn inside, that's when you can often get parts that don't really want to come apart, or things that are difficult to get back together, especially if you have some part that's fragile and maybe starting partly broken, and you don't want to like snap the thing off entirely, but you don't discover that it's broken until you get the gun apart. Then it can be really difficult, frustrating, and painful to try and reassemble it very carefully without doing further damage to something that may already be damaged. This would also apply to guns that are in really, really nice minty condition. If there's not a single tiny scratch on that gun anywhere, it can be pretty stressful to disassemble and reassemble it without any little slip of a screwdriver, for example, or bump of a stock on the ground. When you have guns that are reasonably worn, war surplus type guns, it's something where you don't really need to worry. Obviously, you're going to do your best not to damage the gun, but if a screwdriver slips a little bit, well, there's already 12 scratches on that screw to begin with, and it doesn't really make a difference to have one more. So, guns where you don't trust that something won't necessarily break, and guns that are so beautiful, minty condition that you're really paranoid about doing the least bit of visible damage to them. Those are the ones that are a problem. Christian says, would a fluted chamber have made the use of lubricated ammunition unnecessary for guns such as the Type 92 heavy machine gun and the Pedersen rifle? I would think, in theory, yes. Probably it would have. I have not done any serious engineering analysis of the effect of lubricated cartridges versus fluted chambers. But the general principle says that, yeah, that should have probably mitigated that issue in guns that required lubricated ammunition. But the designers never thought of it, didn't realize it, or it's important to consider the possibility that they looked at it and decided figuring out how to effectively flute a chamber on a mass production gun was more difficult than providing it with a cartridge lubrication system. So they may have considered an option like that and decided against it consciously. Next up, from Robert, having just seen the new Blade Runner sequel, which, by the way, I just saw as well, and I think it is fantastic, and I would highly recommend it, in which there is a twin-barreled pistol In your recent video on the Arsenal Double 1911, I wonder, what are your thoughts on the concept of a handgun with 2 barrels? The Arsenal has plenty of novelty factor. That's one way to put it. I lost my place here. But do you think it could be a legit concept in the future? No. I don't think double barrel pistols will ever become any substantial real thing beyond a novelty. And the reason is, well, I should say that's double-barreled repeating pistols. If you have basically the difference between a single-shot pistol and a double-barrel pistol, that makes sense. Things like Derringers, double-barrel shotguns, for example. If there's no mechanical system going on to feed and eject cartridges, then adding another barrel to have another shot makes definite sense, up to a certain point. You know, a certain point, if you start adding too many barrels, the thing gets really heavy and clumsy and awkward. But with a repeating pistol, be it manual or semi-automatic, having a second barrel is just way more mechanical complexity and too many things waiting to go wrong without all that much benefit. You know, the benefit of an Arsenal double-barrel 1911 over a standard 1911, as a practical matter, is basically none. The difference between firing 2 shots simultaneously and firing 2 shots in sequence is pretty minimal, especially given the added weight and complexity that you have to have in order to be able to fire that second shot at exactly the same moment instead of slightly afterwards. And for that reason, I think just basically the principles of mechanical efficiency tell us that double-barreled repeating pistols will never be a thing, which is, by the way, why they really haven't ever been anything except a novelty until now. Nicholas says, I am curious about when you shoot guns at Julia. Is everyone negotiated specifically with the consignor? Where does the ammo come from? In cases like the Solothurn or the like. Just in general, behind the scenes, So, yes, every gun that you see me shoot at an auction house, in fact, actually, every gun you ever see me shoot is specifically agreed to by the owner of that gun. If it's done at an auction house, then yes, someone representing the auction house contacts the consignor of the gun and basically explains to them, hey, we have an opportunity to shoot this. We're going to do a promotional video on it. We would like to shoot your gun, and for these various reasons, we don't think there's any substantial risk to the gun. There are, you know, I video a lot of guns at Julia. They have way more than I actually do videos on, and I only shoot a small number of them. Some of that is time constraints. It basically takes me as much time to do a shooting video as it does to do a regular standalone video. So if I'm going to do a video on the gun that includes a shooting segment, I'm basically sacrificing the time it would take to do another video on a separate gun in order to have shooting footage in one of the other videos. Hopefully that made sense. In addition, we always look at is there a potential risk to shooting this gun? So some guns are extremely rare prototypes, and we're not, you know, maybe they're kind of fragile. Some guns use really weird ammo that we're not going to be able to get. Those are obviously out. Some guns are in really mint condition, and shooting them would have a detrimental effect on or potentially have a detrimental effect on their condition. So those kind of things would rule a gun out. But, for example, considering the guns that we shot in the last video series at Julia, we did the Colt Monitor. That was a gun where the previous owner, now deceased, had shot the living bejesus out of that gun. That was one of the guns that he really loved to shoot. And so we knew going in that putting another couple of magazines through it wasn't any risk at all to that gun because it already had thousands of rounds through it. We shot the Madsen light machine gun. That is a quite reliable gun. We know where spare parts are available if anything should happen to go wrong with it. Ammo's easy to get. We shot the ZB-26, very similar, very highly regarded gun. They're reliable, they're durable. Nothing's going to go wrong with the ZB-26. Ammo's available, the magazines are available. And we shot the Solothurn. And the ammo for the Solothurn is definitely not readily available. And for something like that, or like the Lottie that I shot there previously, or in fact the 4-bore that I shot at Julia previously, the ammunition for those, in fact all 3 of those, came from ammunition that the consignor was selling with the gun. So with the anti-tank rifles, I don't remember the exact numbers, but the consignor provided 10 or 15 or 20 rounds of ammunition with the gun. And so when we contacted them, we said basically, we are going to reduce the value of the consignment by 4 rounds or 5 rounds or whatever it is total that we're going to shoot, but we think it's probably worth it to you to have video of this for the auction. And in all of those cases, the consignor agreed. And that's where we get the ammunition for the guns, where it's really weird. It's typically stuff that has been included by the consignor. In fact, with the 4-bore rifle, this was particularly important because virtually all 4-bores are kind of custom made. They use custom ammo. The bore diameter is not necessarily exactly standardized. The chamber dimensions are not necessarily exactly standardized. Something like 8mm Mauser has a very clear international standard, and you can just go buy a box of it. 4-bores are not standardized. They're all unique and individual to the guns. So we would not have been able to shoot that 4-bore had the consignor not provided it with ammunition, cartridges, and projectiles that we were able to use for that video. Moving on. Jeff says, what is the difference between a closed bolt and an open bolt? Why would one be more desirable than the other? That's actually a fairly easy question. So the difference is a closed bolt, when it is in the ready-to-fire condition, there is a cartridge in the chamber, the bolt is closed and locked, and then it's ready to fire. And this covers virtually everything semi-automatic, and some machine guns as well. An open bolt gun, when it is in the ready-to-fire position, like, if you pull the trigger and it goes bang, the position that it is in is with the bolt locked to the rear, open, and the magazine inserted with a cartridge ready to feed. The advantage of an open bolt is primarily that it doesn't keep a cartridge in the chamber when you're not actually firing. So in a machine gun, a military machine gun in particular, you might shoot a whole lot of ammunition and get the barrel exceedingly hot. Hot enough that if you left a cartridge in it, the heat could transmit through heat up the brass and then actually heat the powder to the point of combustion without having to hit the primer with a firing pin. That's called a cook-off. And it is a very real potential danger in military machine guns. If you have an open bolt design, there's never a cartridge left sitting in the chamber where it could overheat and cook off like that. So that's the primary benefit of an open bolt gun. The secondary benefit is you get somewhat improved cooling of the barrel if you leave it open at all times so that air can circulate through the barrel in a way that's not possible if the bolt's closed and sealing off the back end of the chamber. So typically you will find open bolts pretty much only on machine guns. There are a very small number of semi-auto open bolt guns, and even most of those are conversions of machine guns. The downside to an open bolt is that when you pull the trigger, before it actually fires, you have the whole mass of the bolt going forward and then locking if it's a locked action. And that mass and movement makes it very easy for your aim to shift between when you pull the trigger and when the gun actually fires. That's called lock time, the period from when you pull the trigger to when the cartridge actually detonates. Open bolt guns have a very long lock time. And so in a machine gun, that's not that much of a detriment because presumably you're going to be firing a burst of ammunition, recoil is going to be adjusting your aim anyway, and you'll typically be firing from a tripod or a bipod that makes it easier to keep the gun on target. On a shoulder-fired rifle, an open bolt gun becomes much more of an accuracy problem. So that's pretty much the pros and cons of open and closed bolt. Angus says the Kirali lever delay blowback system seems like a jolly neat idea. So much so, the Soviets had an AK-type rifle designed with it that outclassed the AKM. Keeping in mind the steel case, good for delayed blowback, and the medium chamber pressure of 7.62x39, do you think the Kirali system could be designed into a modern, incredible rifle? Yes. In fact, I know it could because it was. The French FAMAS is a Kirali levered delayed blowback rifle and has served the French really quite well for, 40 years now, give or take? There aren't a whole lot of levered delayed guns. The FAMAS is kind of about the only infantry rifle style one that really took off, but it does definitely prove that the system is totally suitable, capable for that style of system. And it actually makes for a very simple gun. There's no gas system on a FAMAS. It's kind of right up there with the roller delay blowback that HK did. Next up, Ross says, I am doing research on weapons used in the Spanish Civil War, and I'm a bit overwhelmed by the amount of foreign production arms being shipped into Spain. Yeah, there was kind of a little bit of absolutely everything shipped into Spain for the Spanish Civil War. I'm quite interested in the conflict, but I want to focus my surplus collection on actual Spanish firearms. What would you consider the quintessential Spanish-produced arms of the war? That's an easy one. There would be two. One would be the Spanish Mauser bolt-action rifles in 7mm. The other would be the Astra 400 pistol. Secondary to that, maybe the Star series of basically 1911 copies. But the Astra 400, the Mauser rifles that were in the Spanish Civil War were pretty much all produced before the war. They were in government arsenals, and when the war broke out, the arsenals were kind of looted whenever they could be, and the arms distributed to a bunch of different factions. The Astra 400s, the same thing was true, but there was a lot of actual production of Astra 400s during the war. The Republican forces had a number of different factories making copies of the Astra 400, and I would say, without a doubt, that is the quintessential Spanish-produced firearm that was actually being made during the war. So, the good news also is those are all relatively inexpensive guns because not a whole lot of people are interested in them. Next up, from Carl, says, does the Vickers gun's recoil booster have similar detriments to a muzzle brake, namely redirected concussion and kicking up dirt? Given that you have a Vickers and live in the desert, I figured you'd know. Well, the answer is not really. The thing that the Vickers muzzle brake, well, first off, the muzzle booster on a Vickers gun is not designed to reduce recoil. It's specifically designed actually to increase recoil. It is there to push the barrel assembly backwards in the gun with a little more force than just the recoil of the bullet would give it. So it does that by having this cup-shaped surface on the front of the barrel that takes the impact of some of the recoil gases and uses them to push the barrel assembly backwards to help the gun cycle. When you have muzzle brakes, which definitely do increase concussion and kick up dirt, they are designed to reduce recoil by redirecting those gases not backwards, but typically out to the sides. And going out to the side is what makes it possible for that concussion to impact the shooter. If it comes out to the bottom, it's going to kick up dirt. With the Vickers, you're really taking gases that are going this way, and you're kind of, if anything, redirecting them to be a little more tightly focused going forward. As a result, no, you don't really get any increase in concussion or dirt signature, I suppose you could call it. From Thad, says the FG-42 seemed to be in incredible development, but far more limited than its design would have suggested. By all accounts, it's a terrific weapon, and it's rather surprising that it didn't see much development by the Germans. It does seem logical the next course of its development would have been to be a much more manageable cartridge. Was there any consideration of updating the FG-42 to perhaps an intermediate round like 8x33? If I remember correctly, there was, I think, one prototype FG-42 made experimentally in 8mm Kurz. However, that development was done, just not by the Germans. After the war, the Swiss, at the Bern factory, or Bern Arsenal, did a bunch of development with the FG-42 mechanism. And they built versions that were both in 7.5 Swiss, full-size rifle cartridges, and they actually did a bunch of experimentation with those guns in basically 7.5 Kurz. Not 8mm Kurz, but kind of their own proprietary 7.5mm short cartridge. Those developments never really went anywhere. The Swiss went with other guns instead, but the development did happen. Now, the reason the Germans didn't do it was because of the intended purpose of the FG-42. It wasn't meant to be a standard infantry rifle, really, the way the Sturmgewehr was. The Sturmgewehr was very specifically designed to sacrifice range in exchange for firepower. The FG-42 was designed to replace both the Mauser K98 and the MG-34 or 42 light machine guns. And in order to work as a pseudo light machine gun, it really had to have the full power cartridge. And so had they developed it in 8mm Kurtz, there was really no reason to have an FG42 in Kurtz rather than just use an MP44 or a Sturmgewehr 44. And what the paratroops needed was not, well, what the paratroops thought they needed, what was being designed for them was not just an infantry rifle. It had to also double as a light machine gun, hence 8mm Mauser. That is also, by the way, why the German army didn't ever use the FG42, is they didn't need to combine the rifle and the machine gun into a compromised package that wasn't really as good at either role as the respective original guns. If they wanted a machine gun, they didn't have a weight requirement for jumping out of airplanes. They could just have a really good MG34 or MG42 instead of an FG42 that sort of could kind of approximate that role. Next up, Will says, how effective is forced air cooling? Can it replace quick change barrels for sustained fire? I can only think of a few guns that use it, the Lewis and the PKP. Those are, in fact, the only two that I can think of as well that use it. There may be some really obscure experimental ones as well. The short answer is no. Forced air cooling is not nearly as effective as, well, it's not nearly as effective as water cooling. You can't really have a forced air cooled barrel that is also quick change, because the forced air cooling requires having this radiator sort of assembly around the barrel. Forced air cooling tends to make the guns pretty bulky, and really you're better off reducing the weight of the gun itself by getting rid of that forced air hardware, carrying a spare barrel, and just swapping the barrels if they get really hot. So I don't suspect we will see a forced air barrel in the future. I would be really curious to know more about exactly how effective the PKP is. I'm aware of it, but I've never handled one, and I haven't really seen much in the way of reports on their actual combat capability. That'd be cool to find out. Next up from Edward says, it seems that manual safeties on handguns are falling out of favor with the buying public, and I've heard all sorts of justifications as to why such safeties are actually unsafe. I was wondering if the world's militaries feel the same way. The problem with trying to answer a question like that is military adoption is always determined by a committee or a particular person in that military, and there are always a wide variety of opinions and other priorities involved in a military procurement, and you can't really extrapolate what is objectively good or bad from a variety of military adoptions, because there are just too many factors involved. From a training perspective, well, even from a training perspective, it goes both ways. Having a gun like a Glock that just has an integral safety in the trigger, that makes training very easy, because you don't have to worry about training people to use 3 or 4 different levers on the gun. With the Glock, the manual of arms is simply draw gun, pull trigger, and when you're done shooting, you take your finger off the trigger and you holster the gun. There's nothing special you have to do unless you want to train troops to actually remove the mag and unload the chamber and not carry it loaded. With safeties, well, let me back up a moment. However, you are left with a situation of anytime that trigger gets pulled, it's going to fire around. And so if troops aren't careful with them, you will end up with the potential for negligent or accidental discharges. If you have guns that have a bunch of manual safety mechanisms, you have the opportunity to train very strict safety procedures into all of the troops. You will always carry the gun with this safety engaged, and there's a magazine safety, so if the magazine's out when they're cleaning the gun, they can't accidentally shoot themselves with the round that they forgot about in the chamber, that sort of thing. However, you now have a much more complex training policy, and you've got more stuff that you have to drill into troops, who you are probably also having to train on their rifles and radios and 10,000 pieces of high-tech gear that didn't exist in World War I when, small arms constituted the majority of the actual training that was being done. So there are a lot of factors involved, and I don't think you can adequately extrapolate. So I can't really answer the question, I guess. From Adam, says, a hypothetical question, if the U.S. had decided to adopt either the 1876 or 86 Winchester rifle or something equivalent, Do you think they would have even bothered looking at Spitzer cartridges or bolt-action rifles? Yes, I think they definitely would have. Those Winchester lever-action rifles had this brief time period where they could have been very effective, in fact, far more effective combat rifles than the single-shot and early bolt-action guns that were adopted instead. However, this period basically ended with the adoption of smokeless powder, because with smokeless powder, you now have the potential for high-velocity cartridges that can really benefit from being pointed, Spitzer bullets. And the machine guns that would have been adopted would have absolutely used Spitzer cartridges. And in order to, at the very worst case, even if they didn't care about having that long-range efficiency in a shoulder rifle, they would have wanted to use the same ammunition in the machine gun and the individual infantry rifle just for logistical sake, which means they would have wanted a Spitzer cartridge in the infantry rifle, and the tube magazine in a lever action is not effective, not safe for use with pointed cartridges. In some circumstances they can be, but there are at least a couple military tests I'm aware of where there were detonations in tube magazines. This absolutely can happen, and it would have ended the use of tube-fed rifles with Spitzer cartridges. And if you're going from a tube mag to a box mag, you're probably going to end up with a bolt-action rifle at that point. So, yes, I think it would have been pretty cool if the U.S. had adopted a bolt-action in the latter half of the 1800s, but I do not think it would have prevented the adoption of a bolt-action rifle. I think the potential there was the Krag-Jorgensen and the Trapdoor Springfield could have been replaced with an 1876 or 86 Winchester. However, the 1903 Springfield still would have been adopted pretty much at the same time that it was in real history. Adam says, you stated that the PKM is the best GPMG. Care to elaborate and what you based your opinion on? Well, what I based that opinion on is the overall balance of characteristics of the gun. Every firearm design is ultimately a compromise between a bunch of mutually exclusive characteristics. You can have a gun that is very light and very easy to carry, or you can have a gun that is very durable and will never break. But the durability requires more material. The material is, by definition, weight. That makes the gun heavier. What I really like about the PKM is that it is a gun that is relatively lightweight while also being relatively, actually quite controllable, comfortable in full auto, chambered for a full power cartridge. It is relatively comfortable to fire from a tripod, from a bipod, or it's something you can even sort of fire from the shoulder if you need to. It is quite reliable. It may not be absolutely the most reliable machine gun out there, but it's one where it has achieved 98% of the possible reliability while still maintaining a light weight and a very simple mechanical function. You put it all together. I know there are people who would argue that the M240, the FN Mag machine gun is a better gun, and it may be in some ways. The problem is the FN Mag is also a much heavier gun. If you're going to mount the thing on a vehicle, an FN Mag is probably a better choice than a PKM. But for an all-around, general-purpose, universal machine gun, I think it's, well, I haven't found anything that I would consider a better execution of that concept than the PKM. Matt, who says his name is pronounced Boz, says, why hasn't water cooling with firearms or specifically artillery pieces been developed further? The answer is because it is no longer survivable in today's warfighting world to stay in one position long enough to fire enough rounds for water cooling to really be necessary or effective. We have enough basically electronic intelligence sensor capability on the battlefield today that if you sit in one place like in World War I, you're going to get hit by a missile or a mortar shell or some sort of unpleasantness. And it just isn't necessary. We don't find firearms delivering the volume of fire that would require water cooling. They don't shoot that much. You can get away with a quick change barrel instead and avoid a whole lot of logistical hassle and mechanical hassle. And people forget that those water-cooled guns actually have to have watertight packing material. It was literally asbestos-treated greased string or rope wrapped around the barrel in a couple of different places to make that water jacket watertight while the barrel was actually reciprocating in the water jacket. That was a fairly complex and, let's be fair, a fairly unreliable system. If you didn't pack that thing just right, well, the whole time you're shooting, water's dripping out of the gun and it's making a mess. And if you don't need that, don't have it. Water cooling was, I would say, obsolescent in World War II and obsolete as soon as World War II was over. The Germans showed that you could maintain a totally effective rate of fire with a gun like the MG42 by having changeable barrels instead of trying to deal with the weight and complexity of water cooling. And I can only imagine those problems scaled up to artillery. If it had been feasible, water cooling on artillery probably would have lasted a bit longer, but today, I just don't see artillery units staying in place that long without getting blown to little tiny pieces by enemy counter-battery fire. Next up, Jonathan says, I wanted to know, what is your opinion on restoring relics? For example, you find an old bayonet that's rusted a bit. Do you think it destroys some of the character of the piece if you want to restore it to a functional standard? Would this raise or lower the value? It's a complicated question. When it comes to firearms, I kind of hold the opinion that there has to be a pretty high bar to pass for it to be actually worth restoring a firearm. And it's very often not going to be cost effective. You're gonna spend more in parts to restore a gun than you will get from the value once it is restored. And there are a couple different versions of restoration. One is, for example, restoring a sporterized gun to its original military configuration. And that's the type that's easiest to do. But still, if you're doing that, you're probably going to have a relatively difficult time finding all of the original bits. Ross rifles, for example. An intact Mark III or 1910 Ross is probably a $1,000 gun, maybe more, in its original military configuration, whereas the sporterized ones are far more common and they're maybe a third that value. However, it's extremely difficult to find intact full-length military stocks and then the barrel bands and the nose cap to go with them. And you'll probably spend as much trying to get those. What you'll end up doing is buying a really beat up, bad condition complete Ross in order to pull the stock off to put onto a better conditioned sporter, and this often just does not make financial sense. Now, if you have a completely intact gun that's in poor condition, I think it rarely makes much sense to try and restore it. I think a lot of the value is in the character that is the current found condition of the gun, and trying to re-blue it, the chances are you're going to re-blue it wrong. It will be clear that the gun has been refinished, and that will seriously impact the value of the gun. So it's got to be really, really far gone, in my opinion, before that's worthwhile to do. Dom says, is there any sensible reason why in the 30s Britain and Japan did not develop or try to develop semi-automatic rifles while all the other major powers did? The answer is, well, the Japanese especially did try to develop a semi-automatic rifle. In fact, I believe, videos on all 4 of the different experimental versions that Japan was experimenting with, was testing. And while I don't have examples off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure the British did the same thing. Pretty much everybody was experimenting with self-loading rifles. The question was, were they able to get one far enough along and into production in time for World War II? And the answer was, really, the Americans and the Russians had one pretty much ready before the war. The Germans managed to put them into production during the war, which was quite the feat. And then the Belgians and the French and the British ended up finishing guns after the war and adopting them in the 40s and 50s. Oh, I should add, the reason for this was often where countries were concentrating their funds. The 1930s was the period of the Great Depression. A lot of military budgets were not particularly large. Germany, for example, in its rearmament program was focusing on things like aircraft more than small arms. For small arms, they developed a good machine gun, and then they just made a whole lot of bolt-action rifles. The French, for example, focused first on a light machine gun, and they developed a very good light machine gun. The semi-automatic rifle was a little bit lower priority, and the development process and the funding for it and the timeframes involved kind of conspired together to mean that the rifle wasn't quite ready by the time war broke out. If everybody had known that there would be another world war in 1939, I'm sure a lot of these countries would have had semi-automatic rifles ready, but that, people didn't know the future. They didn't know that there was a specific deadline far enough in advance to adequately design a rifle for the next war. Next up, Matt says, can you tell us about the old punt guns guys would use to shoot ducks on the water? They were a massive shotgun, very cool and effective. Have you ever come across one? Yeah, I have actually seen a couple. I have yet to do a video on one because, frankly, they're too big to generally fit on a table in front of a camera. These things are huge. They're usually 6 to 8 feet long. And the other thing is, mechanically, they're really not interesting at all. They're generally giant single-shot shotguns with usually either a simple break action system or a very simple bolt action system. It's just a couple of locking lugs. You open the bolt, pull it back, put in a giant shotgun shell, close the bolt, and fire the gun. They were generally mounted to recoil absorbing trunnions in a boat because they're far too large and heavy and recoiling to fire from the shoulder. They maybe have stocks for aiming, they maybe don't. The purpose of these guns was industrial level waterfowl hunting, and that's fallen out of favor and legality in favor of farm-raised guns. There just aren't the huge flocks of birds that you can send some industrial hunters into and harvest hundreds or thousands of birds at a time. We do that with farm-raised birds instead now. So at some point I will do a video on a punt gun when I'm able to find one that's in a position where I can actually get it effectively on camera. But I'll warn you in advance, while the effect is interesting, the guns themselves are really quite simple and really kind of uninspiring. Let's see. Simon says, in World War II, which country implemented its small arms best on the battlefield? I would say the answer to that overall is probably Germany. They had a really good universal machine gun going into the war, which served them very well. They had a decent submachine gun. I think the MP40 is a little bit overrated. I really don't like the stocks on them, although otherwise they're very good guns. And then what really does it, I think what really puts them into first place would be the development and adoption and tactical usage of the Sturmgewehr, the MP44, MP43, and STG-44 rifles. Those really would be the absolute model and standard for all firearms development for decades after World War II. And they weren't able to produce them in substantial enough numbers to really have an impact on the end result of the war. In fact, honestly, I think it's debatable. If they'd gone into World War II all armed with Sturmgewehrs, that probably wouldn't have changed the outcome of the war either, because it really isn't small arms that make that difference. It's much larger factors. But if you just want to know what country did the best during the war, I would say Germany. They started with a bolt-action rifle. They ended with the modern assault rifle. All right, and I think we have one more here. We will go with Gwendol, who says, what service firearm gets the most undeserved bad reputation and why? I'm thinking about the Shosha, the Sten, and even the M1 carbine, especially post-World War II. What's your view? Well, I think those three firearms kind of deserve their reputation, or at least they got their reputation for the right reasons. The Shosha is a very difficult machine gun to use effectively. The Sten is a very uncomfortable gun. The British replaced the Sten at absolutely the first possible opportunity after World War II, and for good reason. The one that I think has a bad reputation that wasn't necessarily deserved would probably, I would say, be the Carcano. I think the Carcano got a lot of its reputation, first off, from the general stereotype of the Italians as not very good fighters. It definitely didn't get any help from the Kennedy assassination. A lot of the guns that were available on the surplus market after World War II were not great. The ammunition availability was not good. The Carcano uses a different size bullet than a standard 6.5, and so some, at least, of the ammunition that was available after World War II, when these guns were super cheap and readily, and novel on the market, the ammunition made the guns particularly inaccurate because the bullets were too small to properly engage rifling. These things together conspired to give the Carcano a really poor reputation. Was it the best bolt-action rifle of the war? No, absolutely not. But I think it was a perfectly suitable gun that really doesn't deserve the negative view that it has today. So that'd be my answer, the Carcano. I appreciate very much all the questions I got from you guys. I got well over 100 questions, and there's no way I can spend enough time to do all of them in one go, so I apologize if I didn't cover your question. There were a number of very good ones that I just didn't have time to get to today. So if you're annoyed by that, and if you think you had a good question, please do submit it again next month. I do try to keep an eye out for repeat questions and make sure to work them in as soon as I am able to. If you are not a Patreon supporter and you'd like to get a question in, well, definitely check the link in the description text below. That will take you to the Forgotten Weapons Patreon page. It is the folks there that make this whole channel possible, and you have my everlasting thanks and support. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and we'll be back tomorrow with a cool Forgotten Weapon for you. Thanks for watching.